Hi, I'm Patrick from Douglas Fir Design. Welcome to the Router Bits. If you've just picked up a router or you haven't used one very much before, we've got a video that's going to go through, first of all, what all of these bits do, fairly simply, so you can get a handle on that. And then the second half of the video will go through a couple of really simple operations so you can get machining and start making stuff. I'm going to break the router down into its two most basic control groups. Now this isn't plugged in right now. The first thing is obviously the power switch, which turns it on and off, starts the motor running. And the second thing that I'm going to group with that is the speed control. Never start the router when the blade is touching the wood. So always start it when you're holding it above and you can then plunge into it, or if it's in a hole already, so the motor is not going to be engaged when the blade is touching the timber from stop. What'll end up happening is the router gets thrown. Back to speed, my one goes from 1 to 5, 1 being the slowest, 5 being the fastest. I generally leave it on pretty fast. For most handheld routing operations, I'm using 19mm bits or smaller, and the fastest speed will work fairly well. As a general rule, if you're using really large bits or really deep cuts or really hard timber, slow the router down a bit. The harder the job that the router's going to have to do, the slower the bit should run. For most small bits, you can just kind of run it at full speed. The second control group controls the height of the bit, or the depth of the bit into the timber. And there's a couple of different mechanisms on this router that control that. Now, as this is a plunge router, it can plunge up and down. This is particularly sticky right now. It's been living underneath my router table for a long time, and there's a lot of dust in there that I'm still working out. But you've got plunge operation, which means you can push it into the timber and it'll spring back up. You've got this dial here, which allows you to make smaller incremental changes as you turn this big knob. And then you've got this really small micro adjust dial, which allows you to move fractions of a millimeter at a time. So the general process would be, use this big knob to set the height basically where you need it. Use this little micro adjust to get it exactly where you need it. And then you're going to use the lever or whatever your router has to make sure that's 100% locked off so it can't move anywhere. And it's really important that you do that. The last component of the height adjustment is the depth stop. Now, all routers will have something similar to this. It might not be exactly the same, but basically the way it works is you've got this little turret down the bottom, which will have 2 or 3 little pins. The first one is set, then the second 2 have these little screw nuts on them. What this allows you to do is set 3 separate heights that you can operate at. Say you want to do a 10mm deep slot, you don't want to necessarily cut that 10mm in one go, so you might set the first depth at 3mm, the second cut at 6mm, and then the third cut at 10mm. And that allows you to spread that load evenly so that you can do multiple cuts and always be kind of achieving that same level of drag on the router. It's safer and easier and better for the motor as well. So the way that works is I've got it set on the first turret, that's as far as it can go. After that cut, I rotate it to the second turret and it can drop down an extra 3mm or whatever you adjust it to. And then I drop it down to the third one and it can go to the full depth. Now just keep in mind that as you're going down, you've got a bunch of weight on this and you've got motor noise and you're putting pressure on the machine. You've got to make sure this is locked off really tight, because if you're just like whacking down on that and it's creeping, then your adjustment is all messed up, and that means your cut won't be the same depth the whole way through. Just be really aware of that. In order to change the router bit or put one into the machine, you need to put the base plate as far down as possible. Basically, you want to expose the collet, which is the bit that holds the router bit. You want to expose that through the base plate, and you want to lock it off so it doesn't keep springing up. Something that's important to notice on this router and probably most others, the method for getting this collet to lock so that you can actually tighten it and loosen it is you push this base plate down as far as possible. What happens is as I turn this, a little pin locks into place, so this now the base of this collet won't rotate, and I can tighten and loosen it. If I put this base plate up by just a centimetre, that pin no longer locks and I can't tighten or loosen that because it's just going to spin. So, push it all the way down, lock it off, and now that's locked in place. I can loosen this so that I can put a router bit in, and then I can tighten it back up. Put the router bit all the way down as far as it can go, hand tighten it until it's solid, get your spanner. Your router probably came with one. I lost mine years ago, so I just use whatever I've got and tighten that up. Now that that's tightened right off, I do like to make it really nice and tight. Obviously, you're going to be the one that undoes it, so make sure you haven't made it so tight that you can't get it undone. But there's a lot of force, there's a lot of torque on that bit, and so you want it really held in there tightly. Now I can unlock that, raise that back up, and go about setting the depth for doing our cuts. A router bit is spinning really rapidly, it's got a number of blades on it, and those blades are cutting in a certain direction with the spin of the motor. That's important to know about because it affects how your cuts perform. Basically, you can imagine that this router bit wants to throw this piece of timber in the direction that the blades are spinning. So when you're making a cut, you want to actually be running the timber against that direction, so that instead of giving more force to the throwing effect of this router bit, you're actually working against that to stabilize the piece. Now, this works in two different ways depending on if you're routing on the inside of, say, a hole. You're going to be wanting to run clockwise, and that's working against the spin of the motor. If you're routing on the outside, you're actually going to want to run anti-clockwise, and that's against the spin of the motor. Couple of quick notes on router bits before we keep going. I'm not going to put too much into this because we have a whole library of specific projects that you can do and tips and techniques, but just quickly, this router bit that I've got in here has a blade up each side and there's no blade in the center. What that means is if I try and push this down into some timber, that section in the center is not going to cut in like a drill bit, and it means that you can't just plunge right down. Some router bits do have a blade in the center, so to a certain extent these can operate like drill bits and you can push them right down. It's just important to know because if you try and plunge this, it's not going to plunge very well and you're going to have to ramp it down into the timber, which I'll show you now. I'm going to do a couple of really simple routing processes just to show you what happens when you put a bit into some wood. The first two things I'm going to do are freehand. I'm going to just try and follow a line. This process would be the same if you're freehanding a curve or a straight line. I almost never freehand. There's just very few applications where this is a reasonable thing to do, but it's totally possible. So I'll be actually following on the right hand side of this line. You will not use the line as your center marker because it's just impossible to know where your bit is because it covers the entire line. You'll see what that looks like. I'm also going to plunge the router in and try and hollow out that circle, which again is irregular. It's not something I would do very often, but just to show you the plunging motion, different ways to do that. And then we will try and create a trench that is a straight line, and we're going to use a fence to do that. And I will then move on to really quickly showing how to use the bearing on a router, which your router bit might not have a bearing, but it's a great way to do more accurate work. As you can see with these cuts, even though I followed the line kind of carefully, they're still pretty messy. So If you're trying to do any kind of careful work where the cuts are going to be seen, whether that's letters or you're trying to do something nice, freehand is just not the way to go unless you're going to clean that up afterwards. That's why you use a template of some kind. With the using that piece of ply as a template the first time worked well. It gave me a really nice clean cut. However, you need to set the guide the distance from the edge of your router base to the blade itself, which for this router and this bit is 80 mils roughly. But if it was a smaller bit, it would be a larger distance. So that's awkward because you've got to figure that out. The second way that I'd like to show you is actually using a bit with a bearing on it. Now this process will apply whether you're doing a straight line or something that follows an actual template. So right now, all I'm doing is cutting one long straight trench or channel or rebate. But if I had a template that was round or square, I could follow any shape much more carefully. But by using the bearing, you can actually set the line of the whatever this guide is going to be exactly where you want to cut, which just makes your work a lot neater and a lot easier. Keep in mind that because of the height of this bit I need the bearing to engage with this guide, it means that my depth of cut is a little deeper. So you're going to have to work with that. If this was a 19mm piece rather than a 25, my depth of cut would be even greater. Make sure you clamp this down. You'll notice with all of the routing procedures that I did put a clamp on there, but especially if you're using a guide, because otherwise what's the point? It's just going to move out of the way. I like to use 2 clamps, and then I've got this whole operation on some rubber which stops it sliding around. With all of these processes, especially using a pattern following or a template or a guide, we have a whole bunch of videos. There's a link up here to a variety of techniques which use this router bit and plenty of others. This has by no means been a comprehensive introduction to router bits. There's just so much you can learn. So jump up in this playlist. There's just so many good techniques and projects there for you to expand your knowledge on what is an incredibly versatile tool. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel. We've got heaps more of this stuff coming out. I've been Patrick Holcomb. Thanks for watching.